All right. Um, Good afternoon, guys. Um, I've been really busy, and I've been really tired because I'm getting out of the army, and so I'm in this whole transition process, and so I haven't been getting a lot of sleep, and there's been a lot of things on my mind. But I wanted to talk a lot. I wanted to talk about religious paradoxes because I think it's important. Uh, it's given me a lot of thought, and ironically, it came through this dream that I had last night. And to give you some context of this dream, I mean, context in the sense of like what was happening that day was yesterday I got, awarded for getting out of the army, basically. And suddenly, I think after all, when the day had ended and I was getting food, it was just randomly in the line at Taco Bell. Suddenly, I had like the most excruciating existential uh, dread, anxiety, if that makes any sense, where I was super conscious of just not knowing, what the hell am I doing? What am I going to do? Where am I going? Uh, because again, like my army career is done basically. I'm just tying up some loose strings, some final clearance stuff, and that's it. And then I'm going to be living my unknown life, basically. But anyways, I finally was able to sleep last night, and I'm only going to tell you a portion of the dream because it has a very significant scene where, and this is very mythological in nature, by the way. Um, Basically, the scene of my dream that I had last night was I was kind of going through a temple. It was kind of like in the desert somewhere. I was going through this abandoned temple that had religious symbols. I'm thinking like the cross. I think Mary was in there. Mary holding Jesus. It's a very famous icon symbol. And these were all like statues or you know carvings on white buildings. And suddenly these symbols started crashing down. And I was trying to escape them. So I finally eluded, something crashing down on me. And, suddenly I'm out in the open, basically. And there's a man standing before me. And it's funny because in the dream I'm like, oh yeah, this is God. you know, like this is God. Like I just like in the dream I knew it was God. Um, if you want to talk about outside the dream, I'm like, obviously it's not God, but in the dream, it's God, right? And human form, everything kind of looked like uh he kind of looked like what's that superhero from he kind of looked like that water superhero. I can't even think of his name. He kind of looked like Aquaman, kind of. He had that kind of like build, Aquaman type build, long hair. anyways, that's not the important part. The important part was in the dream, I knew I had to battle him. And right before this engagement happened, uh, the figure that I deem as God in my dream, or that identify as God in the dream, was he said something very he said, and it was a very typical like thunderous voice, right? Typically what you'd expect. And also it was kind of frightening how thunderous and loud it was because it carried a paradox of like it was far away and near at the same time. Um, but anyways, the voice that I heard that was emanating from this figure was, uh, "Don't tell me, show me." And after that, I knew the fight had to engage. Um, but that's when I woke up and I had, a terrible headache. Um, but so this idea of, uh, show me and don't tell me, it, I was really just contemplating on this idea because typically the whole show don't tell is a kind of like the litmus test for good writing. But then I thought about this a little bit more, or good art in general. Uh, but then again, I started thinking about that maybe this is also a good litmus test for living. This idea of show don't tell, and this is where all the religious paradoxes come in as I was connecting the dots in my mind. For example, just to kind of dissect my dream a little bit more, the fact that religious symbols or icons were falling down and crashing, I look at this as the idea of that actually religious icons and symbols, or religion taken as a general concept, can be your idol. It can be your idol. And I think, going back to what Nietzsche, a lot of what Nietzsche critiques is that a lot of these idols are empty, right? And it's important to make a distinction between when a man has taken his religion as idol versus his religion as a means. And I think a lot of the atheistic arguments against religion and against God are only founded in the fact of people taking religion as an idol. And so, in that case, the atheist is no different from the proclaimed Christian, because even the Christian himself takes his own identity as an idol, or the Muslim, or the Jew, or whatever religion you affiliate yourself with. It's very easy to make your identity, make your religion the idol rather than the means. Uh, and I think it's a very easy trap to fall into. But if we want to look at atheism and nihilism, really atheism and nihilism are sort of the counter products of something that should have been in religion itself, that was originally in religion. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not talking about atheism and nihilism seriously, but I'm talking about the idea, for example, atheists. I would actually argue most atheists left religion and the idea of God because they loved God so much and loved the idea of religion so much that when they came to the realization that one, people didn't live up to these standards, that people were hypocrites, that people were um, just failing to live up to the actual, word of God and so on, uh, that it turns to just be a sham and nothing but lies, that this atheistic notion is telling because what it says is that actually there's a bunch of religious figures or a bunch of apologetics going on for religion that is simply just telling and not showing, right? And you could say the person becomes atheist because there is just telling and no showing. And even the idea, so that like that's the paradox, right? And uh, the other thing is, for example, the whole idea about you know prove prove God to me or making arguments for God. I always I've always been against this idea, and I've always tried to make my case why I'm against this, but I felt like finally it became very clear about why I'm against making or proving God to anybody or trying to prove to myself God exists as such. Um, and it's a very simple thing. It's very simple. Um, is that actually, and this is just my opinion at this point, is that actually if you take God seriously, um, that means that whatever idea of God that I have transcends itself. That means, like whatever idea I have of God basically isn't God. It allows me to have an entry point to God, but it isn't God as such. And when we realize this, we have to understand that when we're making a case for God or trying to prove God to other people, all you are doing is trying to prove your entry points to a person that won't be convinced as such. And on top of that, if we take, and the second part to this is that if again we take God seriously, um, I am not in favor of a God that needs to be defended. I am not in favor of a God that needs to be proven, because if that is the case, then that is not God. Um, and so, what does this really tell? Well, basically, it tells that there is some kind of egoic satisfaction that we get from this. Um, that if I can prove God to another human being, then I'm a good human being. Or I get some kind of self satisfaction, um, or it exposes my own self doubts by me constantly trying to prove God to other people. I think Jung exposed this too. So, but anyways, you know, so these are the religious paradoxes, right? And I think Slavoj Zizek, uh, he he actually kind of nails this down a bit when he says that the atheist is probably the most Christian. And in that case, I do see it. I see it because, for example, I've been reading the Bible, uh, and what's actually really funny when you read the Gospels again is that Jesus is the most hated not by what you would call atheists by any definition. He's most hated by people that are of a religious affiliation. he's most hated by people who claim to be close to God and teach the laws of Scripture. And you can find this everywhere in the Gospels, right? Where they kind of mock Jesus and call him the King of Jews, right? And I thought that was interesting because actually a lot of the atheistic arguments for the reason why people don't like religion is actually some of the very things that it's some of the very thing it's some of the very things that Jesus would condemn too. like like honestly, the fact that like when Jesus like came into a church and like or a synagogue and like overturned the tables and was mad at them for selling stuff. I mean, it really shows how religion itself can become corrupt instantly, right? It has that provocation. So, but it also when you read the Gospels again and you start identifying this, it's been exposed. This fact isn't something new. That people have a tendency to self-identify with religion rather than with God, and that actually most people's critique of religion is a fair one because it's just people's relationship with religion and not with God. We'd like to think that whatever concept of religion we have kind of refutes the idea of God, but it doesn't. It only refutes it only refutes people's relationship to religion, which has become idealistic and self-refuting. And you only need to read the Gospels to kind of have an understanding of that. Um, and I think even the story of Jacob exposes the idea that it exposes the idea very well that God doesn't need any defense. Like when you look at the story of Jacob and all of his friends are saying, "Well, hold on, you can't blame God because it's probably you." You know, this idea that it's probably you. Well, see, the thing is, towards the end of the Jacob story, God condemns the three people that were talking about God as if they knew him. And then God almost says explicitly in Jacob, if I remember correctly, that he says, I can speak for myself. I don't need you guys to speak for me. So there is something very paradoxical about religion and the idea of, trying to convince people and all this other stuff. I just think it's kind of like not, uh, I, there's just so many paradoxes, so many. And I, again, if you just look at, the Quran, the Bible, the Quran and the Bible both exposes this type of religious paradoxes where, the Quran exposes this very well, right? There's so many people that will say they believe explicitly, and yet the Quran will call them disbelievers. The Quran also exposes people that pray, and even though deep inside their hearts they're disbelievers, right? They have no intentions, whatever. They're just merely showing. But what's funny is because, and so why does this come back to the whole idea of like telling and showing? Is because, well, the reasons why atheists aren't convinced is because you just have a whole bunch of religious people telling and not showing. And that's why atheists left religion. Is because they're tired of they're tired of people telling and not showing, not living up to the values. And instead, rather, you have religious people telling values, right? Which is very common today, right? Where if let's say you disbelieve in abortion, you start telling people your values, and it creates more of a rift rather than, showing people your values, which is, I think, it's a more intricate and more difficult process to do. It requires more of an ontological participation than just telling people your values. Um, I was going to say more. Oh, yeah. Buddhism. I wanted to talk about this too, to kind of talk about how self-refuting, trying to prove God is. And uh, there's this wonderful story in the Dhammapada, which is like the religious scripture for the Buddhists, where I think a man is dying and he goes to the Buddha and he says, "Can you tell me if a God exists?" And the Buddha just kind of just says, why waste your time answering that question, or trying to answer that question when you don't even know how to take the arrows out of your own heart, kind of thing. That's kind of roughly what he says. Like, he says, you need to pay attention to the poisons in your heart rather than trying to answer the question or trying to ask of me, if a God exists. Like, the Buddha just kind of stays silent on those things, which is, it's always been interesting for me when I think about that, because I feel like the Buddha really took to the most extreme level showing and not telling. And when you take that to the extreme level, you are atheistic in that sense, right? Because most people would say, well, Buddhism is basically atheistic, doesn't have a God. I would argue it's silent on God. It's relatively silent on God. It's so silent that it's atheistic on God, which is very profound when you think about it. Which it's that sort of paradox that to be so silent on God, where you are constantly showing, that it's this paradoxical equivalence of, yes, in terms of telling, you would be atheistic, but in terms of showing, you'd be probably the most God uh, exemplified notion of a man, right? You'd be the most man of God that you've ever seen before in a person. So there is something rather interesting about those paradoxes. And, you know, and that's why I found my dream to be of significance, because the whole idea of praying is that you stop the BS of telling people and actually show. But the thing is that, one, you need to stop telling yourself about God. You need to stop trying to convince yourself about God, or trying to convince yourself of not God, or all these other things. And that actually what you need to do is you need to start showing yourself, which is a whole different experience, and a whole different, and it requires a whole different epistemology, but most of that epistemology is silent because we haven't done that work. And this is something Daniel and I have talked about, that, the reason why it's hard to understand the sort of, the ontology of Christianity, the Trinity, and so on, is that actually it demands in itself a new epistemology. You can't explain that ontology from the epistemology that we have. And a lot of people take that as, a way to refute the ontology, but actually it doesn't refute the ontology at all. It just means that you have to create a new epistemology to meet that ontology. Um, so you need an epistemology to match every ontology. It's basically a very plain and simple, uh, idea that I accept from Daniel, and I think it's very important that we realize this. And I think when we talk about prayer, again, it's a kind of ontology that hasn't found an epistemology to explain the significance of its being. But I will say this, is that prayer itself is a way to your epistemology. So it's almost like you kind of have to go there first, right? It's that famous um, line of thought where you have to exist in order to know. And so I think the same thing is required. If you want to understand the epistemology of prayer, you have to pray in order to know, right? That has to sort of exist in your life in order to know. Um, and the same thing with proving God and so on. It's like, well, you have to first show in order to know God exists. That means you have to sort of dive into some type of ontological requirement in order to match the epistemology of that. Which you could say this is leap of faith, right? That you're diving into some ontology, some way of being, in order to match or create a epistemology so you can match that. But anyways, there's many religious paradoxes in that. And that, for me, it's very important that if people consider religion, I encourage them to find a religion that fits their psychological disposition. And how would you know which religion fits your psychological disposition? Well, taste around. That's all I could say. It should be a very exciting, exploratory time of your life. Taste around. For me, I interpret psychological disposition and religious diversity as something as a sort of mercy of God. And that it's important, whatever religious affiliation you take yourself into, it's important that you understand that this is a means. It's a means, it is not to be your source of self-identification. It's not supposed to be your self affirmation as such. It's actually supposed to be the point of your very self-negation. The point where you decide, whatever religion you pick, the point where you decide and commit with whatever creed you begin with, that you will begin your journey of self-negation towards the absolute. And that's really the whole point of religion, is the entry point to the beginning of your self-negation and the process of your becoming. And I think a lot of people have distracted themselves from this idea that they take their entry point as an end. And when you take your entry point as an end, you're no different. You're actually no better than the atheist at this point, right? Actually, you're the reason why the atheists left religion in the first place. It's because you took religion as an idol, even though the atheist wouldn't be able to sort of consciously explain why he hates that. Subconsciously, he knows that, I would say. Subconsciously, he knows that you've taken religion as an idol. And it shows how many people have taken religion itself as an idol rather than as a means. Because when you take religion as a means, you understand that actually it transcends all self-identification. It transcends the idea of calling yourself a Catholic, a Seventh-day Adventist, Orthodox, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu. It transcends all those things. That's why when we look at mystics and saints, we have to understand that they reach that level. And when you reach a certain level of self-negation, you transcend your own self-identification as Catholic, whatever. What they are more preoccupied with is not their identity, and it's not with their religious affiliation. but it's with their relationship with God. Um, I mean, that's the whole point. We have to keep in mind that that's the whole point, and that's the whole point of showing and not telling. Um, and I'm constantly reminded of there's a couple stories in the gospel where Jesus does a miracle for somebody, and immediately he says, "Don't tell anyone about this." And I've been thinking a lot about the idea that there's just some things that just shouldn't be said. And I've been trying to have more judgment about things that I just shouldn't say. Plain and simple. I just shouldn't say it. Um, that there is some type of sacredness and whatever you experience that needs to just not be said. And I think that, you know, your own relationship to God is kind of one of those things. Because, well, it's one of those things that you need to discern that always going to have its own sacredness with yourself. And that the moment you try to impose that on somebody else, it's simply unconvincing. And it's always going to be unconvincing because it's like me trying to convince you to be like, like a brother in my family or something. Like you're never going to understand that. You're never going to understand that. Um, it's like trying to convince you about me having a girlfriend or something, you know? It just seems weird. Why would you have to, the way people try to talk about God and convince themselves and other people about God is like it's like a guy at the bar trying to convince you that he has a girlfriend. It's just weird. And it just doesn't make any sense. If you have a girlfriend, that's cool. If you don't, that's cool too. You know, again, it's this difference between telling and showing, which is very significant. Um, so you could say probably from watching this video, I'm definitely anti proving God. I'm definitely anti a lot of things. Uh, but I do sincerely been thinking about, you know, reviving people's interest in religion and in God, but in a fashion that, in a way that I can explain it, in a way that cannot convince you, but can encourage you uh, into some type of self-exploration. That I'm not telling you to specifically be a Christian or anything, because that refutes the point, but to encourage you to have a relationship with something beyond people. And again, it's that weird paradox where when you have a relationship with something beyond people, you have a better relationship with people. Because I thought it was the most interesting thing. If you love something that you don't understand, you can love anybody. Really. If you do things for reasons that you cannot understand why, you can do things for people that you will never understand why. It has the potential to enliven your relationships with any person. The problem with religion and the problem with God is that actually they're very self-reflective. It's like a mirror upon a mirror. And basically whatever face you want to see is the face you get. Now, consciously we can argue, well, that's not the face I want to see. But the thing is, subconsciously, that's the face you want to see. Um, the idea of hell or paradise, whether you're concerned for either one of those, though they are fine concerns, I would say they still kind of miss the whole picture, meaning that your ego is still involved. That means you're concerned about, I don't want to go to hell. I want to go to paradise. I want to go here. It's very ego involved. And it's important that actually, in the face of God, it's all annihilation. Um, that your primary concern, the reason why hell and paradise is so frightening, is actually it's kind of distracting in the sense that actually what is stressing implicitly is your relationship with God, nothing else. Paradise and hell are kind of like the idea of like, look, if you have a bad relationship with anybody, it's hell, right? And that's basically what it is, right? If you have a bad relationship with anybody, it's hell. If you have a good relationship with anybody, it's like heaven. It's so great, so wonderful, and that's basically what it is, right? So it requires an ontological participation, and it also demands an epistemology. But again, just to go back to what the Buddha said, if you want to ask about why God exists, or prove to me God exists, or why should we believe in a God, I always like Buddha's approach to this. This is, why concern yourself with such questions? More like when you should be paying attention to the poison arrows in your own heart, because fundamentally that's the thing that's going to kill you. And so I like this idea that Buddha sort of self redirects, and that even the idea of trying to be convinced of a God, I mean, really, to be honest, very few people, you're never going to convince anybody. I've been in the army, and you can barely convince people to join the army. My initial observation is this: that actually anybody that gets convinced of God or convinced of joining the army is that they already had it in their heart, to be joining. They just needed a little bit of a push. Other than that, they were already open to joining the army, and they were already open and believing in God. Plain and simple. So, that's why but it's more about getting to know people, really. It's more about getting to know people. And then paradoxically, that's about getting to know God, but it depends how you face yourself. Which I always like, Merton's conception, Thomas Merton's conception. He's like, if you face yourself towards creatures, then that's probably what you're going to get of God. But if you face yourself towards God, then you understand creatures, which is so ironic, and so paradoxical. But yeah, I kind of spewed for a long time, but I just wanted to talk about this, and this has just been on my mind for a while. Religious paradoxes, what is religion, human relationships, is this all intertwines, and I realize now that all my questions were deeply connected with each other. So, all right. Well, anyways, thank you guys for watching. Take care.